What's up in War Eagle, everybody? It's your guy, Ike Jones, and we are back at the Auburn Express, powered by the War Rapport here. Next stop on the train is to talk about game 3 of the season, previewing that. Auburn versus New Mexico. The New Mexico Lobos come to town week 3. And let's be honest, it's not a game in which you expect for Auburn to have any challenges in it from a top to bottom standpoint as far as talent is concerned. Auburn should be able to outclass New Mexico in this one. But again, this is not something you can sleep on. Listen, teams out of the state of New Mexico, I'm not saying it's going to be a repeat of New Mexico State last season, but I am saying we got to talk about the team and see what they present. New Mexico is going to be coming to town, coached by Bronco Mendenhall in his first season as the head coach there. His return to the Mountain West. He was previously head coach at BYU years before, but most recently he was coached 2 years ago at Virginia. Not a great team there at Virginia that he left, but and one that's still struggling under Tony Elliott. But still, Bronco Mendenhall makes his return to coaching as the head coach of New Mexico. And he is a guy who has been known to be a bit of a giant killer as a head coach, right? Like he's had those BYU teams out in the Mountain West up there winning, and he was like 3-1 against Power 5 at one point in time in that conference. So he's had the opportunity to win some big games in the Mountain West, and he's attempting to rebuild a program that was struggling really defensively the last few years. And he's a defensive guy. He's a defensive coordinator by trade. So coming in as a defensive guy, trying to get a team that had struggled defensively to get back into its prominent place. Coming along with him are a few coaches that are from his previous tenures at head coaches in both Virginia and BYU. The offensive coordinator, Jason Beck, is a guy that was with him at Virginia, and he was with him at BYU as well, or excuse me, he was at BYU. I'm not sure if those times overlapped. I could be incorrect about that. But what I do know about Jason Beck is he was the guy who was coaching quarterbacks there at BYU when Taysom Hill was there. So he's had the ability to be really creative in those years at Virginia, where he was the offensive coordinator. They lost their starting quarterback, and they ended up having to have a tight end play quarterback the last couple games of the season, if I'm not mistaken, where they went to kind of like a just kind of a really like an RP, not an RPO, excuse me, a run option based thing with a tight end. Again, that Taysom Hill style thing where this guy's not. He's just an athlete, so we're just going to put him back here and see if we can orchestrate some things, and was able to handle things admirably, right? So he's a creative offensive mind that's able to go out there and really get a run game in New Mexico that last year performed fairly well. They were 18th ranked in the nation as far as run games are concerned. So he's going to be coming into a situation of a team that has been running very similar style offense to what they're going to be trying to incorporate. The difference is, though, this New Mexico team lost a lot in the transfer portal. 7 offensive linemen exited the transfer portal this offseason for New Mexico, which is going to be a huge issue that they're going to have to overcome. But in return, they got quite a few starters back from Power 5 conference folks, right? So they got a guy from Texas A&M transferred in. There's some guys that came over from Syracuse, right? Like they've got quite a bit. Let's kind of take a look at the offensive line transfers here. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all 5 that are guys that are projected to be starters for this team on the offensive line, all coming in via the transfer portal. And then they have 1, 2, 3 reserves, 4 reserves, 5, 6 reserves that are there that are transfer portal guys. So they've been able to reshuffle the deck there after losing 7 guys in the offensive line room. Again, a part of that team that was able to be an 18th ranked team as far as offensive productivity in the run game. They've been able to reshuffle the deck and try to get some talent. But the question is whether or not they're going to be able to implement those things offensively quickly enough to be able to compete in this game with Auburn. Again, my thoughts are no, they're not going to be able to do that, but you got to play the game and make it happen out there on the field. Before we transition over to the defense, definitely want to give a quick word and shout out to the sponsors of today's show, and that is Joy Mode. Listen, you guys know that the performance boost is something that Auburn needs to have for their offense this season. Maybe not Joy Mode, but even though it'll work with your cardiovascular, so maybe some guys want to use Joy Mode. I don't know if it's a good idea to have young college kids out there with Joy Mode. So let me just not even suggest that because I don't want to get into no crazy situations. However, Joy Mode is right there for you. Make sure you have your folks head over to usejoymode.com when you do use code Rapport when you do. That gets you a little something off your purchase, 20% off plus free shipping when you do that. And the folks over at Joy Mode will definitely appreciate the business. If you have any issues with stamina, or really if you just have some issues with cardiovascular health, maybe you can get a helping hand from Joy Mode. Make sure you go to usejoymode.com and use code Rapport when you do, 20% off plus free shipping. On the other side of the football, right, you've got defense. And again, this is what Bronco Mendenhall hangs his hat on. He's always had good defensive teams that have gone out there and competed defensively. And this team shouldn't be any different. The defensive coordinator, Nick Howell, there for New Mexico, is a guy who was with him there at Virginia. Good news for Auburn fans. He actually, Bronco Mendenhall, as I said, took kind of a sabbatical from coaching the last 2 seasons. But where Nick was the last couple of seasons, Vanderbilt. And we know what this Auburn team did to Vanderbilt last season. So, he's at least familiar with Auburn. So he's going to be able to go out there and game plan a little bit for some of the guys that he's going to be facing. But different Auburn offense and some different weapons out there for him to have to contend with. But that Vanderbilt defense was not really able to compete with Auburn last year offensively. I don't expect this season's going to be much different for them at New Mexico. But I do expect for that team to compete in the Mountain West a little bit better than what they had been competing previously, specifically on the defensive side. Again, their offense had been okay, but the defense had been left something to be desired there for New Mexico. As far as the percent of what they have returning on both sides of productivity, only 41% of the people who did something for them offensively, when we're talking about, again, leading rusher, he exited the program last season during the offseason, and only returned, I think, 2 starters in the wide receiver core, actually a tight end and a wide receiver. So 2 pass catching targets are only 2 that returned for this team coming into the season. So they're having to reshuffle the deck quite a bit here as far as productivity is concerned. So really, there's not much to note about what New Mexico is going to be going into the season. We're going to have to wait and see their first couple of games before we're really able to tell what this New Mexico team is going to be able to present, both offensively and defensively, and who rounds out into the top of that depth chart for them. Again, if you're looking at this game right now, I would absolutely say this is a game that Auburn should win. We're not here lamenting whether or not Auburn's going to be getting a victory against a team out of the state of New Mexico again in Jordan-Hare Stadium 2 years in a row. This Auburn team should be able to compete with, shouldn't have any issues with New Mexico coming in trying to compete with them this season. Now, they do, again, have quite a few guys that have transferred into the school that should factor in pretty heavily. When you talk about the quarterback position there, you've got Devin Dampier, who is a sophomore there for him, a dual threat guy. But then the transfer in Soljay Mavia, I believe I pronounced that correctly. Forgive me, Soljay, if I mispronounce your name. The transfer over from BYU, another guy who's kind of an athletic dual threat guy. So going to be interesting to see how Auburn's able to contain the dual threat nature of these quarterbacks, presenting a little bit something with their legs. And again, with the offensive coordinator that is there for them this season with New Mexico being adept at utilizing guys who have that skill set, I believe that they're going to present a unique challenge for this defense, but not one that you would anticipate Auburn being incapable of dealing with, right? So really back-to-back weeks, you're going to see a quarterback situation that's going to be more of the dual threat, where it's not really the arm that you're most worried about. You're worried about the off-schedule stuff from this quarterback. And really, I mean, when you think about it, that's going to be the case for the first 4 weeks of the season. When you talk about Alabama, A&M, Cal, and then now New Mexico, and then week 4 when you get into the situation with Arkansas, which we'll talk about here next up on the schedule for Auburn. You're going to have 4 weeks in a row where you're going to be facing this dual threat quarterback situation, guys who maybe their arm isn't the most spectacular thing about them. It's their ability to be off schedule or really present unique situations for the defense within the box to have to figure out how to make sure you're a hat on a hat and being assignment sound. So good tune-ups there, all to be able to get into some of the stuff that they're going to see in week 4 versus Arkansas with the first 3 games of the season. So it works out really well for Auburn in terms of that. Even though it's going to be different levels of athleticism, you'll be able to take some of the principles that you've learned and apply to that week after week after seeing Alabama A&M that's going to present a lot of different types of looks for you offensively, after going and facing a Cal team that is going to really try to spread you out and utilize the legs of their quarterback. And then their week 3 with New Mexico trying to do some of the similar things of getting their quarterback out in space and really wanting to utilize a unique run game to be able to try to challenge the assignment soundness of Auburn's defense. Looking forward to seeing how that comes. On the defensive side, again, this team for New Mexico, a lot of transfers coming into this team, guys that have a little bit of Power 5 experience, but not going to be something that I anticipate being a big issue for Auburn having to deal with, right? Like, a lot of the guys who they have on this team that are going to be competing are not like the top end of the conference, or excuse me, we're not the top end performers for these schools, right? They've got a couple of guys that you really want to take a look at. Let me get my thoughts together here. They got a couple of guys that you maybe want to take a look at that were P5 performers, right? Dominic Tatum, who is the transfer over from Washington State, and then Noah Pola Gates, who was the transfer over from Nebraska. Both of those guys will probably factor into the safety room competition. And then you've got some guys from ULM. Speaking of ULM, we'll talk about this later, but you remember that running back that I mentioned that was the tip of the spear for that run game for them? He transferred to ULM, right? So we'll talk about him a little bit later when we get down further into the schedule. But again, I don't anticipate this being a situation where Auburn should have to struggle in this game. And if they are struggling, then we got some other things we need to be talking about. But what I want to hear from you is, what are you thinking about this team in this game? I expect a lot of people talking about a blowout in this one, but what kind of things do you anticipate seeing week 3 there for Auburn versus New Mexico? Hopefully it's going to be a good one. We'll come back and we'll preview that game after we've had an opportunity to look at both of these teams for a couple of weeks during the season. But definitely leave your comments right down there. All right, that's it. That's all I got for you guys. Again, like the video, subscribe to the channel. We'll be back at you with more coming up. Breakdown of the Arkansas game leading into the preseason. Until the next time, and as always, War Eagle.